Thank you, Tyler. Thank you also the rest of the team at the Carsey-Wolf Center. It includes Patrice and Emily. And of course, thank you to Lisa and Winddance. Before we begin, I just want to say a few words about Film Quarterly. We are the oldest running film studies journal in the country. We are published by UC Press in both print and online form, and we're partially funded by the Ford Foundation's Just Films initiative, which allows us to collaborate on and host live events and be a part of things like this. I'm the assistant editor, as Tyler said, and we have B. Ruby Rich, the legendary queer and feminist film critic, at the helm as the editor-in-chief. Ruby has really brought a unique editorial vision to the journal during her tenure there over the past 10 years. For example, we have not stayed true to our namesake. We publish on an array of media from around the world, new and old, which includes film, TV, video games, virtual reality, web-based media, which includes documentary and fiction forms, and even sometimes installation art. As long as it's about the moving image and has a social and political engagement, we are interested in it. Lastly, we pride ourselves on casting a wide net in terms of readership. We aim to bridge academic and public intellectual communities who just love rigorous intersectional analyses of visual culture. Which brings us to your article, which is the basis for this event, of course. Your piece called Millennial Messiahs is in our current issue, which, as Tyler says, is available in print form in the lobby. And when Winddance and Lisa pitched this idea to us, we were so enthusiastic to have writing on these shows and on the tech industry. So thank you for your wonderful piece and also agreeing to do this in-person event to unpack and elaborate on your research. So let's begin there. What led to this collaboration?
Well, I think we saw it since I had just finished writing a book based on interviews with women and men in Silicon Valley. And Lisa and I both are big consumers of tech TV. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to kind of integrate the sociological research and bring that into dialogue with television. And obviously, a lot of the tech CEOs are our celebrities. They're part of the celebrity culture. And so we both have a lot of respect from each other, and we thought it would be a really nice collaboration.
Yeah, we worked at the same university for over almost 2 decades, and and had a chance to collaborate in a Mellon Sawyer seminar focused on race and immigration in California. Winddance invited me to be part of that, and I learned a lot through that year-long seminar. And in the seminar, we also read Winddance's book with graduate students from, I think, 7 different departments. And it opened up a lot of dialogue and conversation. And then after we had read the book, these 2 shows that we had become aware of, Super Pumped and WeCrashed, seemed to resonate with a lot of the sociological findings in Winddance's book. And so we thought, well, let's keep our kind of mutual learning process going. And now that we've read your book, let's think about it in relation to these 2 TV series that are trying to tell these stories of fallen tech bros. So that's kind of how we got into it. And then we co-wrote together, and that now it's in the piece. So it's been great to learn from Winddance.
And what a great experience to be able to watch a show with that kind of research and writing in the background of your mind as you're watching it and analyzing it and thinking critically about it. What an awesome experience to have. So we thought we would begin, because we don't want to assume that everyone has seen these shows. So we thought we'd begin with just showing the trailers for both shows, just to give people a taste of the shows that they discuss in their article, WeCrashed and Super Pumped. So let's lay out the historical scene here before we get into the actual shows. So I want to ask Winddance, because of the research that you did, the field research you did for your book, Geek Girls. Can you talk about when these shows take place, which is the 2010s, and kind of when these startups emerge? When much of this, also the show's actions take place, how does this moment fit within the larger kind of trajectory of what we've come to understand as big tech?
So I would say that it starts with what has been called the PayPal mafia. So the guys who founded PayPal, and then they sold it, and there was a lot of money made. And Emily Chang writes about this. She works for Bloomberg, but she writes about this in her book. I think what happened is there was a concentration of wealth in the Valley, and you had a small number of men who were able to finance startups. So the PayPal mafia, they financed Facebook. So we have Facebook, founded in 2004, followed by WeWork and Airbnb in 2008, then Uber 2009, and then Lyft to 2012. So there's a lot of money. It's basically a fiscal climate in which we have what sociologists would call pattern recognition. So young men, particularly if you've dropped out of Harvard or Stanford or MIT, were able to attract the financing, the venture capital. And the issue is that women weren't able to get that kind of venture capital. And so even men who had a lot of failed, serial entrepreneurs like Adam Neumann, they were still able to get the money because this image of the entrepreneur it was gendered as masculine, as white, or Asian male, but you had to drop out of the right school. So, if you were Black or Latinx and you dropped out of an HBCU, you were just a dropout. But and so a pattern developed after Zuckerberg and others in which people who dropped out and became entrepreneurs could get this money, right? And it was a very small group. So I think it was a historical moment that's now over, where the money was flowing. And Stanford and MIT played a key role because you had a network. So I talk about the concept of geek capital in the book, which is you have the right networks, right? So you can get people to finance you. And it just grew and grew and grew. So I think but this happened after Zuckerberg, after Facebook. So you had a period of 8 or so years where they're being financed. And so we get this image of this is what someone who does a startup looks like.
Yeah, I would just add that this is a moment in the tech industry where we're shifting from an era of Web 2.0 or social media to a moment that some scholars have called platformization, where suddenly you have digital companies leveraging existing industries such as the transportation industry or the real estate industry. And both Uber and WeWork are creating digital services and platforms that kind of connect to and extract the value out of these other industries. And so I think that that's an important moment in 2010, this shift toward the platformization of the internet and the creation of all kinds of digital services. By 2019, you have so many companies participating in those kinds of activities that we have a so-called unicorn stampede, where there are, a number of companies, including WeWork and Uber, Pinterest, Slack, a host of others, that were each valued at more than $1 billion when they were preparing for their initial public offerings. And so you suddenly have all of these companies with fairly new services that had evolved over the decade that are some people are saying their value is heavily inflated to the point that some bold congressional leaders are testifying at hearings and warning public investors about losing their money in these ventures. Yeah. So just building on what Winddance was pointing out about that earlier period and how it led up to 2019. Which,
yeah. I think that's so helpful and so necessary for us to understand before we get into the show. So let's talk about the shows themselves. And I recommended that we look at, we do some more clips and look at the opening credit sequences, in part because, first of all, opening sequences, of course, are the first impressions that viewers have of shows. I think that they're largely taken for granted, by the way. But also importantly, they repeat, right, before each episode. So there's this kind of like further embedding or implanting of the kind of ideas or what they're trying to get to convey to the viewer. Even if you can skip over them, you're still seeing a little bit of it these days with streaming. So let's take a look at those opening credits, and we're also going to watch just a little bit of the first episode, the beginning of the first episode of WeCrashed, and talk a little bit more about unicorns.
Okay.
So much in there, just in those opening sequences and then the opening of WeCrashed. I don't know where we want to begin, but maybe you guys could think a little bit out loud together about what we're watching here, how it's setting the scene for the episodes to follow.
Well, what struck us, and one of the things that we wrote about and theorized in our article, was all the female silent service providers of different ethnic backgrounds and that scene really sets up this. You see his power reflected and expressed through all the people serving him, and waiting on him, and they don't have a name and they don't speak. So that just clearly communicates his status and power immediately.
But there's kind of a group of people interested in writing for television about these major economic entities and coming up with, creating a cultural forum in which viewers can think about the corrupt workplaces, the corrupt financial incentives of these companies, and allow viewers to think about this largely unregulated industry. So we have Super Pumped and then WeCrashed for Apple TV. And I just want to mention that we are on a writer's strike right now too, and I just want to mention the names of some of the writers that have worked on these shows. Please. Sarah Acosta, Emily Hornsby, Saifi Deary wrote for Super Pumped, and then WeCrashed is Eleanor Burgess, Ava Anderson, Zenzel Price, Elisa Karasik. These are people who are probably on picket lines right now who wrote this material and maybe finding a hard time finding work at this moment. And I just think it's important to acknowledge them and some of the creative talent on these shows. But we start with these also just to give you a sense of how viewers are invited into these diegetic or narrative universes. The kind of, even the sound is quite similar across these opening sequences. It sounds like almost these bubbly little worlds. It reminds me of like champagne bubbles popping or something. And there's an interesting acoustic continuity across the sequences. We showed the opening sequence of WeCrashed because of just looking at the domestic life world of the CEO and how his day, as Winddance mentioned, is started by an entourage of domestic workers who open the blinds, bring him his breakfast, light up his bong, get him ready to go off and tackle the kind of tech world. And he doesn't know this, but he's walking into his own, he's been voted off the board. He's been voted out as CEO. So it sort of starts there, and then the show does exposition of all the backstory leading up to that moment.
I think it's also important to note that this was also based on the writings of Mike Isaac, was a Wall Street Journal reporter. So journalists also played a key role in documenting the rise and fall in real time. And I think it was the article by Mike Isaac that was really central in his being fired. And of course it was adapted by the writers. But there were a lot of writers involved in this, including journalists.
Yeah, it was adapted from a lot of memoirs, investigative reports. In the case of WeCrashed, it was adapted from a podcast called WeCrashed, The Rise and Fall of WeWork. And then it was adapted for streamed television. So I think it's interesting to mention that kind of industrial context.
And I would say, it's the podcast was really important. I mean, it was really central. And I would say in the case of Super Pumped, Susan Fowler's book, Whistleblower, her memoir, which she wrote after her blog So we also have blogs. I mean, my research, I drew on blogs and memoirs as well as interviews, but we have a lot of people to thank who were blogging and creating diaries that also provided the inspiration for these shows.
Yeah, I know we briefly talked about, besides all the labor that, of course, is behind these kind of, how these stories emerge, we also talked about just how all the products that are created out of kind of true crime these days, right? And now it's true con, right? Which are these stories about conning, which, these kind of have a relation to. And I read an article recently that true crime was actually referred to as a lifestyle, which is really, I mean, when was the last time, if ever, you heard of a genre being referred to as a lifestyle? Like, because there's products in Etsy and they're, and there's just so much fan culture around true crime. It's really bizarre. But maybe we'll come back to that in a little bit. I want to stay also with kind of what these shows are depicting. Something else that also struck me in watching that was just the insulated kind of existence of these CEOs and these entrepreneurs. And just the ways that, like blasting of Katy Perry's Roar, so that he can't hear anything, that everything's drowned out, right? And that they have to put it on when he walks into the office. So there's this really kind of, this amazing, and of course it's the moment when he is about to get fired, right? Or be told to step down, that we are introduced to the Roar, and then then he has to leave. So let's talk about then him walking through the office and the kind of like tech culture, the culture of the office that he's walking into. So coming back to your book, Winddance, perhaps you can talk a little bit about about the kind of what we see in this, what you call brotopia, right? That is in the tech industry, and talk about how the shows are trying to kind of intervene or represent that.
So, Brotopia is the title of a book by Emily Chang. One of the things that I found, and I think it is accurately represented in this, is, and we'll see this in some other clips, the amount, the excess. You didn't see it all in that clip, but the amount of drinking and partying and mandatory socializing, it's a hermetically sealed world. And I think the difference between this business culture and, say, the late 20th century, earlier cultures, workplace cultures, is that there's no real separation between work and home. Like, you don't have a separate private life from work. And so that actually empowers the CEO more, because you have the workers are generally below the age of 30, the majority. Most don't have children, and so this becomes their whole world, I think, which enhances the hermetically sealed and the power of the CEO, because they're providing everything. We don't see that in that clip, but what I found and what other research has shown is there's also a lot of fear of not pleasing the CEO, because everyone has to sign non-disclosure agreements. So we don't see that, but the background to this culture is the fact that even when you're interviewing, before you've actually gotten a job offer, you're signing a non-disclosure agreement, which is basically signing away your freedom of speech in exchange for a job. And that makes it difficult for the employees when they leave or are driven out or basically traumatized. They can't even talk about it. But that also produces this culture of conformity, because you've signed away your rights. And that's another part of the not being regulated by the government, not having regulations. And also they're not unionized. So part of that, we're all happy, and the party culture, what underlies that in part is the non-disclosure agreements and the fear and the ultimate power. And that's part of the messianic culture.
And we have some clips that we can show, unless Lisa, you want to chime in right now, we could show the clips and would you like to chime in?
I would just say that, one of the concepts that we try to develop in the article is this concept of the millennial messiah as a kind of archetypal figure during this period of maybe like 2010 to 2019, roughly, that exemplifies a shift in the kind of celebrity culture of the CEO figure within the tech industry. Prior to that, there had been people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, Larry Page. These people too certainly had celebrity personas within the media culture. But what we see is a kind of insertion of cash flow to the point where the figure shifts because they're sitting on so much money. And we start to see a kind of hedonistic tech bro culture where they've got so much money that they're partying like crazy. They are refusing to abide by any local or federal regulations and taking deep pride and satisfaction in that idea and getting away with it, essentially. Their staffs that they're surrounded by, whether they're legal counsel or advisors, are just letting them do whatever they want as long as they allow the valuation of their enterprise to continue to evolve and intensify. And so we try to study the power dynamics of this figure, as well as situate the figure in relation to as Winddance already mentioned, the silent service providers who are kind of in the background in many scenes throughout these shows. They have no voice. They tend to be racialized and classed in particular ways, and yet their labor day in and day out really helps to elevate and build this kind of hedonistic culture for these millennial messiah figures.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, and we write about this at the end of the article, it's important to note that the corporate boards are aware of this hedonism. They know this is going on. They continue to get financing from banks. And so there are a lot of actors. It's not as if this isn't known that Adam Newman drinks that certain tequila. I'm forgetting the brand.
Don Julio, 1942.
That's right.
Right, because I don't drink tequila, but it's important to know that this isn't a secret. The bankers all know, and every time they go to ask for more money, they're given this money. So this is being supported by, everybody knows what's going on. And it really does come down to the overvaluation and the unicorn status. So there are a lot of actors supporting this. And it's also, they're making more money than a lot of small countries. They have a lot of power. But there's a lot of collusion. And we can talk about this later, but when we think about the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and then Bank of the Republic, part of that is we're now seeing the government acknowledge that there wasn't federal oversight. And this is part of the same ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the hedonism is sort of like, okay, it's okay that you're engaged in this excessive behavior because a lot of people are making money.
And we should say we're not opposed to hedonism.
Yeah, we're not anti-hedonist.
But the way that it gets woven into the corporate culture is a little troubling. And you'll see a few clips coming up that maybe signal what some of our concerns might be.
Yeah, we're all about pleasure, but some of it's compulsory. That's also the problem. Some of it is like you can't opt out of the drinking. And so if you're in a situation where you can't handle drinking, or in my case, I'm from a family of there are a lot of alcoholics and I just can't drink a lot, that's just part of the culture. You have to participate in it. So it's really, that's one of the problems. It's not voluntary.
So why don't we watch some of those scenes of hedonism? One shot that I was wondering if we would be including it or if it would be in those clips, you guys may remember, is this really incredible shot, close-up of a tap that's just sitting open. Do you remember this? I think it's like the morning after a party, one of the office parties. I don't know if it's beer or kombucha or what it is, but it's just sitting open and the liquid's just pouring out. And I think it's to talk about excess and waste. It's such an pointed, emblematizes the kind of like pointedly this visual metaphor of waste and the company's excess that we see also here. So in terms of the scenes that we just watched, and in terms of how these shows frame questions of excess, waste, abuse, the things that we've just seen, do these shows go far enough? How do you guys feel about, what are your thoughts on how they're framing whether it's hedonism or the kind of issues that you've already laid out, questions of race, class, gender, etc. Talk about the mixed bag that maybe some of the shows that you talk about in the article.
Well, first I would say that these scenes don't show the pressure on the employees to participate, and how one of the things I found in my research when I interviewed women was if they refused to participate in this, they often lost their jobs. And there was a lot of job hopping. So among the sample I had of about 98 people, they stayed on their job an average of 2 years. And a lot of the women talked about how they could not decline to participate, or they wouldn't get their promotions, or they would get negative peer reviews, because there's a lot of peer reviews. So I don't think it adequately depicts the amount of coercion that's involved and how participating in this culture is essential for getting promoted or having respect. And it also doesn't show the amount of sexual harassment and sexual assault.
Yeah, I mean, I think the shows are, of course, they're definitely not perfect in terms of the way they represent these tech world universes, right? Like, but they do provide a space in which the viewer can think about gender discrimination, the politics of sexual assault, labor exploitation within these workforces, and they do make some of these experiences vivid and palpable. What ends up happening, though, over time is that the narratives really suppress a lot of the potential for those issues to become bigger and more, those issues to become disruptive and indicting of these operations. But they get contained, and the shows really promulgate this logic of internal regulation by the corporation. And the way that it manifests as well is through this figure that we call in the article the female fixer. And these often are executive white women who are appointed to clean up all the dirty work and make sure that the CEO prevails, whether in the corporate boardroom or in the court of law. And so that figure is really kind of the internal fixer, where they can constantly say, we don't need to have, federal regulators come and do a site visit because we're working on this. And an example is at Uber, they brought in Eric Holder, who was in the Justice Department under the Obama administration, and then went on to work in a private firm. And Uber contracted him to lead internal legal investigation of a host of sexual assault and sexual harassment claims within the company, and generate a report that allowed them to just sort of contain it and encourage training for their personnel. In any case, I don't know if this is answering exactly what you were getting at.
No.
Well, and the timing of that is they wanted to contain it before the IPO. Right, so they were concerned about it, and then they ended up replacing him. But I also think what we see is a lack of female solidarity, because in that one scene, you see Susan Fowler is going to Austin asking for help, and she's thinking about how much she's going to make during the IPO, because she's one of the women who's been there the longest. So you also see how capitalism plays out, or how the potential to become wealthy really undermines solidarity in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to show some clips in a minute that deal with those issues of sexual harassment and gender inequality in the workplace. But I want to just stay for a moment on this issue of the show's kind of tight focus, especially on the CEO character and its inabilities, or maybe at times there's a kind of like fanning out and looking at other, like Susan Fowler and these other characters. But at times the limitations of, again, it's kind of the narrative structure and the kind of character development there. Super Pumped is a really interesting example of this in terms of the drivers. right, and how their kind of narratives play out. And there's one driver in particular that you guys talk about in your article. Do you want to at all tell the audience or speak to the attempt to kind of dramatize that driver or the Uber drivers' experiences?
Well, I think we write about, so one of the things that we noticed is often there aren't a lot of representations of, the workers don't speak a lot.
Right.
But this was an example of a driver who was an immigrant. I think he may have been Egyptian, but this was rare. This was one of the few moments where we see the driver's perspective, and we see like he's not able to earn enough driving the Uber, and like you see the worker vulnerability. I think that was a rare scene, and that sort of supports our analysis that it does contain critique, and also there's just this general fetishizing and glamorizing the CEO.
Right.
And we don't, so that was an example that makes the case that we rarely, that was the only driver that ever gets a voice.
Yeah.
And is also representing the exploited immigrant laborer. And that was an exception, I think. I think that was there was only one scene like that.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I was going to say something else about the worker, but I don't know.
Well,
Go ahead.
there's a scene in which the Egyptian-American driver, there's been a policy change at Uber that leads to additional costs that the drivers have to incur. And it turns out that he happens to be giving Travis Kalanick, the CEO, a ride that night. And so the driver takes the occasion to confront Kalanick and say, hey, could you rethink the policy that you've implemented recently? It's really hurting us. I can't afford my car payments. And they have a kind of fight, like a verbal fight in the car, and it becomes really, it's staged in an interesting way because you got this constrained environment and radically different power dynamics between them. And they end up having a blowout, and he's recording it. And this actually happened.
This is
he
you can
had
find
a video.
this. Yeah.
The Egyptian driver had a video of this encounter and ends up releasing it online after talking to his partner at home about it, and it goes viral. Yeah. And it exposes and gives further public awareness to the lack of ethics among the CEO of Uber and the really outrageous behavior that he engages in, especially in relation to his workforce. It just put it in bold relief and crystallized it. So that scene was pretty important, but the voice of the workers is very limited.
It's faint. Yeah. I think it is a really effective and poignant moment of checking the privilege that we've been watching, and in some ways I think that's the double bind of these scenes, right? Is that that looks like fun, and that is glamorized, the partying and the kind of living excessively, but of course we need to see those scenes of who pays the price, not just the investors and the board members, but also the employees and those kind of quasi-employees like Uber, right? The Uber drivers. So maybe what we should do at this moment is take a look at those scenes that deal specifically with gender discrimination, and then we can come back and talk in a little more detail about those dynamics. So talk a little bit about what we're seeing there, and we're seeing pretty, I don't know, not necessarily elaborate, but definitely certain formal devices being used, editing, whether it's editing or the music or the graphics with the counters. Talk about how you guys see these shows attempting to tackle this issue of sexual harassment, gender inequality, et cetera, in these tech workplaces.
Well, I think, so the scene with Susan Fowler where you have the graphics and the numbers behind her, that was a really powerful scene because it's one of the only scenes where we hear the women, where she's speaking directly to the camera, and we hear her, she's representing all the women who've been pushed out. And that's very powerful because we haven't seen that before. This scene occurs also after she's reported her experiences to management and nothing happened. So I think that was an example of them including the voices of the women. And as we know, Susan Fowler's blog was what led to Travis Kalanick being taken out, fired basically. And that's what led to an investigation. But once again, that was an exception, right, in the show. It stands out because it's one of the only moments that we see the issue directly of the toxic atmosphere for the women. And it's also interesting because once I said earlier in my research, most of these women went and worked for other startups, like they found other jobs. And so it is interesting. There are so many startups that people were able to move, but once again, they don't talk about their experiences, right? They go to the next job and they can't say anything because of the NDAs. And so this is a revolving door of women coming in, they stay for a year or so, they either leave or they stay long enough thinking they can cash out, right? Because everyone's waiting for the IPO and they're thinking, oh, if I can just make it through another couple of months or another year, I'll be able to cash out.
And it, of course, perpetuates that silence surrounding these experiences, these toxic,
Exactly.
horrible.
And I think what was also powerful, and Lisa and I wrote about this, was the silence, how you don't hear them speak in that scene where Ariana Huffington is interviewing them, but then it pulls out and you don't actually hear them. And I think that represents how they're silenced through the NDAs in part, right? And so it doesn't go anywhere. Did you want to say something else
Yeah,
about
no,
that?
I think building on what you already said, Winddance, and just the contrast within this one series of Super Pumped between the direct address that we see from Susan Fowler as a whistleblower. We call her she's a type of female fixer in our analysis, but we call her the renegade that like blows things up and disrupts practices that are, she tries to disrupt practices that are oppressive. But yeah, when Ariana is brought in to fix things as an executive fixer, she's in a glass case. And so it's this kind of mythology of transparency within the tech workplace, as if there's an open flow of information and you can see what's going in all the offices. And the irony is that, it wasn't until things got really bad where she actually, after the Holder investigation, where she had people come in her office and share any incidents of sexual harassment, inappropriate behavior, even sexual assault. The woman, the blonde woman that you see that doesn't go in, had been sexually assaulted as a senior member in the company, but decides not to report it.
Because I think she was also, in real life, one of the first female employees. So she's also looking at cashing out, right?
Yeah. So I think it's important to think about how, popular television is dramatizing these kinds of scenes in workplaces and shaping ways that people might be thinking about these situations. What does reporting look like in the workplace? What are the repercussions and consequences for those that do report or that don't? How does the workplace respond when it enacts and stages these kinds of situations? The shows certainly provide a kind of terrain to think through these power dynamics and to stage them in certain ways. But as we argue in our piece, it ultimately does so in a way that quells most of the voices and suppresses most of the voices and experiences of people at the cost of what it would do for the PR of the company. But there are a lot of really important whistleblowers that have called out wrongdoing in tech workplaces, like Timnit Gebru and Rebecca Rivers, who worked on the Google AI and ethics team and were fired for writing a report that called out some of the power dynamics of Google's AI projects. Of course, Susan Fowler, Frances Haugen at Meta, had exposed personal data collection at Meta. There's a whole bunch of them. And I think these figures are really important. They seem to be some of the only options. Maybe AOC, although she's not running again for re-election, I think.
But I think it's also important to point out that Facebook changed their name to Meta after this stuff started coming out, after the whistleblower stuff. Then they rebranded, right? So the rebranding to Meta occurred after a series of whistleblowers.
See, I keep waiting for that anthology series, Whistleblowers. When are we going to get that? That are actually the stories of whistleblowers. It seems like someone's sitting on that. I'm sure there's all kinds of issues with disclosing certain things about certain stories that, but
there has to
nonetheless.
There has to be a psychiatrist in that series.
Maybe in a few minutes we'll open it up to the audience. Maybe we also want to just dive a little deeper into the question of race here, because we've been talking a lot about gender, and obviously we've been thinking about things intersectionally too, with specifically the Muslim Uber driver. But you know, Winddance, especially in your book, you talk so much about the racial dynamics in Silicon Valley. How did you see it playing out in these shows? I'm thinking specifically about this one type that you guys talk about in your article that we haven't talked about today, which is these kind of black male internal regulators. And also, I can't remember the character's name, but the woman whom Adam brings on in WeCrashed, the black woman who he brings on and who ends up quitting. Right. So those are just two examples of you know, kind of how the shows represent race, but maybe you guys can talk a little bit about that as other instances as well.
Well, I'll just start by saying, in my research, I found that actually a number of the black men I interviewed left the tech industry before the book came out, but the black people who I met in Silicon Valley, first of all, a lot of them were not from the U.S., typically, you know, well-educated British accents, but they typically worked as diversity reps, right? They were like they were concentrated in HR and diversity reps, and they were actually used as the spokesperson to spin the demographics. So when the annual reports would come out and the statistics would be really horrible, like 6% Black and Latinx combined, they would bring out I think her name is Maxine Williams. They would, like Facebook would bring out the black former actress with the British accent to explain why they were doing so well despite these numbers. So they were sort of, I mean, that's what I saw at that time. They were brought in, as well as LGBTQ employees would be brought in to do the spinning and to talk about, even though these figures look horrible, we're really doing well, even though we hired 7 people out of 2,500 people globally. And so that's what I saw in the Valley. In this show, as we write about, the black men are brought in to kind of form a disciplinary role, right? But it is somewhat limited. It takes a while. There are a few scenes we didn't show here, but they're still contained too, because they're not really total insiders, although they are board members. But I think what the black men in the show exemplify is the white male solidarity on the corporate board, right? And then you bring in the outsider, and it doesn't disrupt the brotherhood, so to speak. What would you say?
I think that, the way that the figure, the black male characters play these roles on boards as moral authorities, where they're the ones that are questioning the morality or the viability of the CEO's agendas.
But they lose usually in the votes, right, initially.
Well, but they crack it open. They're the ones that are calling things out and cracking things open. There is a way in which the white male board members tend to kind of form a block and want to keep the person in power because it could jeopardize the whole operation and its accumulating value. So everything is about trying to keep the continuity of this figure in place that is so disruptive and so outrageous and so excessive because he's accumulated value around him and created this ethos. But it's like a house of cards, because it's also, the more crazy things get, the more the whole thing could implode. Yeah.
But the clips we didn't show is when you have Jamie Dimon in the room J.P. Morgan Chase, and he's still writing checks. You know, until the very end. He's still writing checks. Because they're still looking at how much money they can make. And I think it's really interesting to think about J.P. Morgan Chase and Jamie Dimon coming in to, quote, rescue Silicon Valley Bank when Jamie Dimon, you know, actually it was a big player in both of these companies, and they're getting the money to keep going. So it's, So the bankers are in the room, too, with the corporate board.
Just to mention a little bit more about the racial dynamics, not necessarily of these shows, but there was a report, it's a little dated now, but it's called Diversity in High Tech, and it was done by the U.S. Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. And a couple just quotes from this, like among executives in the tech sector, 57% of employees were white, 36% were Asian American, and 1.6% were Hispanic, and less than 1% were African American. And then they also had
Staggering.
And that reflects the workforce too, because you mentioned Timnit Gebru, who's in Google Brain. When she was fired by Google, Black women represented 1% of the people in that organization, 1%. So.
And Winddance's book is really about the kind of racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual dynamics of employees within these companies. It's an ethnographic study. It's really interesting to read her book and then look at these shows in relation to the book.
I was saying before that I wish that these screenwriters would read this kind of literature, right, to tell the kind of stories that you found in your while doing your field research and conducting those interviews and talking to those people. I mean, I wish we had more stories like that, and perhaps less of the white bro CEOs that are the celebrities of kind of our moment, as you said. Maybe it's a good moment to open up to the audience if folks have questions.
I just had a question about the periodization of and how you're arguing historically for when you saw this beginning, and your endpoint seems 2019. So, you know, what does the pandemic do to the logic that you've just discussed?
I mean, we wrote this a year ago. I think that, you know, we've seen the mass layoffs, and we've seen the collapse of a couple banks, and I think that is a product of the industry not being regulated. What I would like to add to that, though, is these companies aren't able to do these layoffs in Europe, where they have more labor protections. So, for example, in Germany and France, these companies that are laying off the Americans, they're actually being forced to negotiate with unions there. So I think what's really sad and sort of embarrassing is we kind of need the EU. We're sort of depending on the EU to regulate these companies because the U.S. government's not doing it. So when we look at the future, we look at regulation or examples of places where there are labor protections and fewer scandals, it's in Europe, in mostly Western Europe. So I think that's interesting because you're not seeing the same. I mean, Credit Suisse had some issues, but we're not seeing the same problems in Europe that we're seeing here. And I think one issue is there's more regulation there. There are more labor protections. And so there is really a gap in terms of, especially when we look at regulation.
Yeah, I would just say that the question about the pandemic and its role in, you know, a moment where the economy really collapsed. If you look at the charts, you really just see, like, you know, a dive down, and there's been a recovery. But as you've noticed, and as Winddance mentioned, tens of thousands of workers have been laid off within the tech sector, and they've been really trying to tighten their belts financially and streamline their operations and go through this kind of economic efficiency phase where they even reevaluating their own value. But I also think that, you know, one of the things that we end the article with is we point out that both these CEOs were removed from their positions ultimately. And then just a couple years later, they were reappointed as CEOs as new quote-unquote disruptive ventures. One's called Flow, that's Adam Newman and a kind of new international real estate venture.
For housing.
And then Kalanick was doing, I need to look up.
I forget, but they both have started new startups. And in fact, Adam Newman was getting, like, already had big investors. And their argument was, look at how well he did in disrupting the real estate industry. So now they're giving him money to finance his new venture, which is about housing. So they don't seem to have really suffered from that. But in terms of the pandemic, I would also say, look at the profits. And one reason we're seeing these mass layoffs is the shareholders still want their money. They still want to have the same profit margins, right? So they've made a lot of money. They want to keep the profit margins up. And we don't really see the U.S. stepping up to regulate. And we're behind. So once again, we're looking to the EU.
I thank you. That's just terrific. I want to know so much more from you all about your kind of comparative analysis of these two shows, you know, in basically celebrating tech broism, you know, at the same time it's supposed to be having a critique of it, but it has so much fun with it, for one thing. And then shows do try to have some kind of analysis, you know, in both cases of, you know, women in the workplace. But I'm just wondering, you know, kind of how you assess their success and failures at that. But I'm also thinking about what you might think about, I mean, the earliest iteration of this that I know is Silicon Valley, you know, which you know, the show, Silicon Valley,
Right.
where they were basically the Beavis and Buttheads of tech bros.
Right,
You know?
right.
And although it too had a kind of analysis, you know, women were marginally better than the tech bros, but then they ended up being as complicit or worse than the tech bros. But anyway, so I'm just kind of wondering about your overall analysis of you know, just kind of how in-depth and meaningful the critique is. Because it's also just like, you know, you got this spectacular fun of just watching all the hedonism and, you know, and we won't call it toxic masculinity.
Well, I think we see this as these two shows as part of a cycle of what might be called tech TV shows that, you know, Halt and Catch Fire, Silicon Valley, Mr. Robot, Startup, The Dropout, Severance, a whole bunch of shows have come out probably over the last decade that try to stage tech company operations. And I think we were interested in the kind of audacity of these shows and just they just stood out to us because they had just come out and
They came out during the pandemic. You know, Constance, I would also say that when you think about Silicon Valley, so that came out in 2014. That was actually before any of these companies had released the demographics of their workplace. So it's not until 2014 that the San Jose Mercury News files a Freedom of Information Act to force these companies to reveal the demographics of their workplace. And that's when we find out that it's like 2% Black and, you know, 4% Latinx and, you know, X percent is Asian. And they don't really break up Asian versus Asian American. But we didn't have any data because prior to that Freedom of Information Act, the government colluded with tech companies to make the argument that information about their workforce was a trade secret and they could be hurt, the economy could be hurt if it were released. So by focusing on these two shows came out after all the scandals, right? Because the scandals started in 2016. So there were a series of scandals and class action lawsuits, and then we did have the New York Times reporters. And so I think what separates this from 2014 is it's not funny now. And that was a comedy. You know how I'm not into comedies, Connie. But like, it's not really funny now because we've had all the lawsuits, we've had all the discrimination suits, we've had, you know, we've seen the negative consequences. So that was a different moment. And I think things shifted kind of beginning roughly in 2017, because by 2017, we're starting to see, oh, this is worse than we thought. And women are, and also by 2017, Ellen Powell has lost her lawsuit. And, you know, we're starting to see women, white and Asian American women, come out and say, yeah, I drank the Kool-Aid. I didn't know it was so bad. I didn't realize after 10 years and not working with a single Latinx or Black person, I didn't think there was a problem. And that starts to fall apart when we get to 2016 and we start getting the memoirs and the legal cases. Does that make sense? So I think
and when Trump becomes president.
And then Trump becomes president. So I think Silicon Valley was a different moment. It was an earlier moment.
It also just normalizes this kind of post-regulatory paradigm where you can expose sexism and sexual assault and racism and exploitation and then just ignore it. You know, like it's really problematic how that gets kind of rationalized by these shows. You know, bring it all up and then reward the guy after you fire him by giving him $12 billion to do the same thing over again. The pattern and the paths through which these people move through capital is crazy.
And it's really shocking if you read the literature that sociologists produce, people who study inequality in organizations in the 70s and 80s, and we're seeing continuities across 5 decades in terms of the gender inequality, the gender discrimination. Like, that's what's so shocking, is these are the millennials. They're supposed to be better than the boomers, right? And it's just, as you said, like, and we have more data now, and nothing's really changed, and they're still getting financing.
I think that's it. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to our esteemed panelists.
Thank you.
Have a good night.